of Research Integrity and Culture Week 2025, which is this year a collaboration between the universities of Strathclyde, Heriot-Watt University, the University of Dundee, and Queen Margaret University. I'm Grace Murkett. I'm a Research Policy Officer at the University of Strathclyde, and I'm one of the many members of the organising team for Research Integrity and Culture Week 2025. I'm extremely pleased that we're able to deliver this timely panel session today, as higher education sector institutions are increasingly looking at ways to promote positive research cultures and monitor the progress that we're making. At Strathclyde, we are working towards our Strathclyde 2030 strategic aim for a rich and distinctive research culture that enables all members of our research community to achieve and develop, and that delivers high quality research. And we're looking at measures of research culture to support delivery of that aim. And I'm aware from discussions with colleagues across the sector at other universities that this is something that many other institutions are also looking at. So as well as those internal drivers, we've got external drivers to measure research culture, not least REF 2021, the people, culture and environment element, for which indicators and assessment templates are currently being piloted. And within that context, I'm pleased to say we have got a panel of speakers that are involved in measuring research cultures in different ways, who are going to share their experiences and perspectives with us today. We've got Sarah Wally, who's joining us online as a research strategy manager at Newcastle University, and she'll be discussing how they're measuring research culture at Newcastle University. We have Hugh Fulham-McQuillan, a postdoctoral researcher at the University College Dublin, who'll share some insights from his project looking at the effect of research cultures on well-being. We've got Dr. Ralitza Madsen, who's a principal investigator at the University of Dundee and a member of the UK Committee on Research Integrity, and she's going to share an overview of the UK Committee on Research Integrity's project to develop indicators of culture that support research integrity. And finally, Jelana Pringle, Director and Deputy CEO at CRAC Vitae, who led on the REF 2029 People, Culture and Environment Indicators project. And she's going to outline that process for us and some key considerations that they operated under. After the speakers, there will be plenty of opportunity for Q&A, so do please start thinking about what questions you might have for our speakers today. But before that, I just want to do a small amount of housekeeping. So the session is being recorded to create an online training resource, and that session will be uploaded to YouTube and shared with attendees after the session. Hugh has very kindly he's going to share some groundbreaking exclusives with us before they go to preprint, which means we'll edit the recording slightly to remove those until they have been published. Discussions should be open and inclusive. Attendees and speakers are all encouraged to share their experiences and their opinions. So let's respect the contributions of everyone. For Strathclyde staff here in the room today, you might want to record your attendance at this session as an activity on Pure, and that demonstrates your engagement with the topics of research integrity and culture, which you can then evidence at your next ADR. For those of us in the room, we're not expecting a fire drill, which means if there is one, we need to get out through these doors. And the toilets, if you need to go during the session, are just out this door, down the little stairs, and on the right. So to really stretch out what we can call housekeeping, it would be remiss of me as an ARMA co-champion for research evaluation special interest group and a co-lead for the UK COARA National Chapter, alongside colleagues from Loughborough and Swansea University, not to do a quick reminder of what we mean when we talk about responsible research assessment. So this slide is a really quick recap of the key lessons from responsible research assessment principles. And I have put an initiative against each one, but you know, there's a lot of overlap, so don't hold me to them. To start off with, we've got start with what you value, which is the first step of the scope framework, and one that I certainly come back to repeatedly when I'm thinking about responsible research assessment. Assessments should be designed around what it is that we care about, what it is that we want to encourage, and what it is that we want to monitor, not just what data is available. If we don't start with what we value and only measure what can easily be measured, we're compromising on our values, and we'll find that we're narrowing the scope of activity such that the things that we care about, the things that matter to us, but are difficult to measure, like interpersonal interactions in research cultures, will be ignored. Secondly, we've got base assessment primarily in qualitative evaluation, supported by responsible use of quantitative indicators. This is one of the core commitments of the Agreement on Reforming Research Assessment, which forms the basis of COARA, the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. We can't assess quality with quantity, but quantitative information can help us to make an informed qualitative judgment if we choose the right metrics and use them appropriately. And so, similar to this, the metric tide reminds us to use quantitative metrics with humility and recognize their limitations. The research cultures are so complex and multifaceted that we can't expect one metric to assess it all. So let's be clear about the limitations of the metrics and then use them within those constraints. The Leiden Manifesto encourages us to keep data open, transparent, and simple. Is there open source data that we could use in this evaluation and which would allow everyone to see how we've come to our judgment? If not, how can we make the evaluation as transparent as possible? Simplicity enhances transparency, but then needs to be balanced against the complexity of research cultures. Revisiting COARA, we should be designing evaluations with the direct involvement of those affected. This supports the adoption and acceptance of evaluation by fostering trust, but the greater range of perspectives included in the design process also means that the content is less likely to cause unintended consequences. There'll be fewer contradictions and incompatibilities within assessments, and there'll be greater awareness of responsible research assessment principles. Finally, topping and tailing that list with the scope framework, we need to consider the potential unintended consequences of the measures chosen. Measurements establish incentives and can have systemic effects. Many of the problems caused by existing research assessment processes could have been avoided with more thorough checking of the potential unintended consequences. Taking the time to really think through what could happen if something is made a target can help to mitigate against negative impacts for the people involved, for the staff involved. So with those lessons in mind, I just want to pass to our first speaker, Sarah Wally from Newcastle University, to tell us about how they've used those responsible research assessment processes to develop Newcastle's approach to measuring research culture. And Sarah is joining us online. So for those in the room, I'm going to move to online. I'm going to stop sharing so that Sarah can share her slides.
Thank you, Grace. There we go. So can everyone see my slides in presentation mode? Is that presenting like that?
Yeah, now we can. That's perfect.
Brilliant. So thanks so much for that introduction, Grace. It's set my talk up really nicely. So I'm going to be talking to you today about how we've been developing responsible research culture KPIs at Newcastle University. So as Grace mentioned, I'm Research Strategy Manager and I'm based within Research and Innovation at Newcastle University. So because part of what I'm going to be talking about today rests upon local context, I thought it would be important just to share very briefly with you the local context within which I'm working at Newcastle University. So we are a large research-intensive university in the northeast of England. We have just under 30,000 students and just over 6,000 colleagues. We're known for doing kind of socially engaged research and education, which has an impact. And since 2018, we've been operating a vision and strategy, which is underpinned by core institutional values. And our research strategy that I manage is one of the 4 chapters of that vision and strategy. The Research Culture Initiative, the Research Culture Action Plan, is one of our key initiatives within the research strategy. We launched a Research Culture Action Plan back in 2022, which has 41 actions within it. We've since prioritised, and currently we're rolling out 6 priority projects, which you can see on the screen here. And just to acknowledge my wonderful colleagues that I work with, who are on the left of the screen here, and that's our what we call our core research culture team, and we're a cross-departmental team. So Chris Emerson, just under myself there, he's from organisational development. Connie Zellick, she's from our strategic projects and change team. Natasha Morvner is our Associate Dean for Good Research Practice. Candy Rowe is our Dean for Research Culture and Strategy. And Nicola Simcock, last but by absolutely no means least, is our Research Culture Manager. And together, we work with many colleagues across the university to implement our Research Culture Programme and Action Plan. So it was a few years ago now, back in 2022, that Candy Rowe and I were invited to develop a research culture index that was designed to append to our research strategy key performance indicators, and not only append, but help to develop the kind of research culture indicators that sit within our research strategy KPIs as a whole. So thinking about that landscape of responsible metrics and responsible research evaluation that Grace really nicely introduced there, we wanted to do this in a responsible way. So we talked to the ARMA SIG leads, who back then were Matt McCallum and Lizzie Gadd, and they connected us to the INORM scope framework, which back then was quite an innovation in the research landscape. So I've worked in research administration and management for about 10 years now, and I'm probably as guilty as anybody else for plunging for the metrics that are at your disposal in the systems that you've got access to. But this process is a bit different. It invites you to take a step back and to start with what you value. So what matters most in your evaluation context? It then encourages you to work round this wheel, moving on to context considerations of those values. For us, the question was, what do our values look and feel like? Then using that framework you've developed, you then list a range of options for evaluation. Then you put those under what I call the microscope, doing 3 tests. So one is, are the options for evaluation meaningful and useful? For us, that's in the context of our strategy. Secondly, are they feasible? Can your systems measure them? Do you have capacity to measure in a way that kind of satisfies the benefits? And thirdly, as Grace mentioned, thinking about unintended consequences as institutional metrics, in our case, cascade through the institution, reaching perhaps individuals in their PDRs. And then maybe once you've kind of rolled out this evaluation for a few years, you may want to come on to evaluate the evaluation. Is it still fit for purpose? Is it doing what you had designed it to do? So I'm going to talk you through how we've implemented the scope process to develop what we hope are responsible research culture indicators. So I think it was back in 2021, maybe 2022, we brought together colleagues through an open community invitation to come together to ask the question, what defines a positive research culture at Newcastle University? So we had 100 colleagues from across our research community, across job families, across disciplines, to come together and answer this question. And they came up with 4 values-led domains that have come on to really shape and drive our work that we're doing in the research culture space. So they are collaboration and collegiality, freedom to grow and explore, fairness and inclusion, and openness and integrity. So then we moved on to the second part of the wheel, which is thinking about context considerations. And this is, as I said earlier, thinking about what do these values look and feel like. Now, I won't read out all the examples on the slide here due to time. I'll just focus on fairness and inclusion. So colleagues in the room wanted this to represent us having a diverse research community. They felt this was all about kind of having a psychologically safe research environment to work within, having fair processes and practices, and also having a strong sense of belonging as well. So that then mapped onto the next phase of the process, which was listing options for the evaluation. And we had a much longer list than what's on the slide here. These are the ones that we selected after the probing stage, which I'll go back to in a moment. But just sticking with fairness and inclusion, we came up with 4 measures. So diversity of UKRI grant holders, survey questions, and you'll notice actually all these have survey questions attached, and that really speaks to the process of doing that values driven piece first, because actually a lot of data you'll have in your systems isn't quite cutting it. It's not actually speaking to the values that you've generated through the exercise. We wanted to look at kind of training and attendance measures of people attending awareness raising sessions, particularly on topics like EDI, and also looking at diversity of committees, because that really speaks to our action plan. And the 4 highlighted in red there with an asterisk are those that we pulled out of the index and situated within our research strategy key performance indicators that reports to our council. So back to the probing stage, which precedes that point that I've just shown you of having a selected series of options. Some of the measures or options we had to exclude. So bullying and harassment reporting, whilst a really valuable and important measure, the question was, what is this particular option for evaluation telling us? So if it goes up, is that because our processes of creating a psychologically safe way to report have improved? If it goes up, is it because actually the environment has become more toxic? So we're working on that at the moment through our programme level work to think about more suitable measures, because we do really want to have a measure in there on that topic. The same kind of principle applies to research integrity misconduct rates. And the other one that went in the bin, temporarily at least, was around credit. We felt that was important and valuable, but just isn't feasible in our current systems. So just to touch upon that evaluation piece, we've just started this process, so we haven't quite finished the evaluation piece 3 years later. We're actually conducting a research strategy refresh. Our strategy is 6 years old, so we're conducting the scope process again. And this has been quite a useful exercise for our research culture indicators, because I think one of the tensions potentially of doing this is that, you know, having community generated indicators is great and wonderful, but there's always a question of, well, how does this align with institutional priorities? So we've been thinking about those institutional priorities and thinking about values such as financial sustainability, but also thinking again afresh about research culture, because 6 years ago, that wasn't really in common parlance. So using it as an opportunity to really think about our strategy and what matters now in 2025, that perhaps didn't matter in 2018. So this, for our research culture indicators, particularly the ones highlighted in red with the asterisks on, it's been an opportunity to kind of reprobe those and put them back under the microscope, if you like, and think about new options where that's needed. So one example of that is the indicator on the diversity of UKRI grant holders. Actually, we found that wasn't as useful as we'd hoped it would. And actually, what comes out of that is perhaps not within our control. It's actually in the control of UKRI. So we're thinking of some interesting new options to measure our work in that space, because we are also really passionate about ensuring that we extend our grant holder pool in terms of protected characteristics. Now, of course, we need to wait for REF-PCE to conclude before we can sort of nail down this exercise. And also, as I've kind of alluded to, we're developing programme level measures as well. And we want all this to align, particularly as these measures cascade through the institution. We want streamlining of approaches to evaluation of research culture. So just finally, my final slide here. If anyone's thinking of using the scope approach, I definitely recommend it. You know, it encourages you to put your values first, to really think about your local context as well. And also, I think the approach helps you to build trust with your research community. You can, of course, co-design, but even if you don't choose to co-design, I think it shows your community that you've put thought and care into the measures you're selecting. Of course, there are downsides, and I would say one is that it can be quite time costly way of doing things, particularly if you're doing that consultation piece, and that's not always a welcomed approach. I think the evaluating the evaluation stage can help address some of these issues as we're addressing now. One frustrating part from my perspective as well is that some important areas can be missed off your selected indicators. So, you know, you might have some really valuable measures, but they just don't pass the tests of feasibility and unintended consequences. And there's no clear way around that. And also, of course, change takes time. So you could come up with these wonderful measures, but unfortunately, within the kind of reporting periods in which you're working, the dial doesn't shift. Again, I think some of these things can be addressed through that evaluation stage at the end and prompt you to do some more thinking. So thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing the other presentations today. I've put my contact details on the slide here in case anyone would like to email me after the session today. I've also just popped a couple of links in there to a couple of articles I've written with Candy Rowe on this topic if you're interested in finding out a bit more. But thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We were on mute, so you couldn't hear everyone applauding you, but thank you very much for sharing that workthrough example. I'm going to share our slides again and then hand over to Hugh.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hugh Fomkun. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in University College Dublin, working at the Research Culture Initiative. And today I'm going to talk to you about our project on the relationship between mental health and well-being and research culture in the research community in UCD. So UCD conducted its first research culture survey in 2021. And while the survey did not explicitly include any measurements or questions on mental health or well-being, in our open-ended questions assessing how people feel about research culture, a number of respondents did emphasize the centrality of mental health and well-being to their conceptions of research culture. It was due to responses such as this, and also previous research literature indicating that researchers, particularly PhD students, have lower levels of mental health than expected, that we included questions on mental health and well-being in our second research culture survey in 2023, some of the findings of which I'll be talking about today. So our main research question for our project was to discern which elements of our current research culture promote positive mental health and well-being and which need improvement. Today I will be talking about mostly our network analysis. I conducted a cluster analysis. We'll be looking at that and what that means, and also some of our regression analysis findings. So we had a good enough response, 680 complete responses from a variety of demographics within the research community, including a good number of roles, including faculty, postdocs, technical officers, research managers, and PhD students. So in terms of how we measured research culture, and I suppose it's good to emphasize this point that for us currently in UCD, we're measuring research culture as a means of, I suppose, a litmus test every 2 years and see how it is faring in response to our initiatives, which I'll discuss briefly at the end of this presentation, but which this current project is a part of. So I suppose from Glasgow Research Culture Surveys, we took some of the what you could call core aspects of research culture, the aspects everyone kind of thinks about when they think about it, such as open research, research integrity, and so on. But also we took some questions from the Wellcome Research Culture in 2020. I think it's called What Researchers Think About the Culture They Work In. And so these were interesting questions. So essentially with all these items, we're asking respondents, how do you feel the university supports a culture of open research and so on? Or in terms of the second ones, they're mostly like, do you agree with these statements? Do you feel supported by peers and colleagues and so on? So those questions from Wellcome Research Culture are those aspects of research culture which would be more intuitively related to mental health and well-being. We also had some open-ended questions, like in our first survey. I won't really be talking about those today as I'm still conducting analysis and the findings. But as you'll see, we're really, again, assessing how the research community feels about research culture. And as way also, we'll be including further questions in our next survey, but also how to, just to ensure we're not missing anything that they value. Okay, in terms of mental health then, we use psychometrically valid scales to measure depression, anxiety, and well-being. And we also include this question from Wellcome on how stressed people feel while working on an average day. Okay, so network analysis, for those of you who aren't familiar with this method of analysis, it's a really nice, well, it was new to me until last year, but it's a really nice way of analyzing interconnected data without having to resort to exploring the relationships in relation to, say, a dependent or various dependent variables. So you get to analyze everything on the same level. And you end up with a nice graphical representation of your network, as you can see in this little image here. So nodes would represent your items, i.e. our various research culture questions. The edges represent the relationships between those items. So we use our 4 clusters to populate regression models. So we had 3 outcome variables: our depression, well-being, and anxiety. So with our 4 research clusters leading to 12 regression models. So I suppose to summarize the main findings, all these items here were significant for each outcome variable. I think what's interesting is obviously aspects such as feeling that a research career is isolated and lonely. You'd intuitively assume that's going to be associated with poor mental health. What I think is interesting to look at is those items that are unique to research culture and which were significant predictors, in this case of increased mental health, those items we'd want to encourage. So feeling that university understands what constitutes research impact in one's discipline, that was really interesting to find, and also feeling able to spend time undertaking continuing professional development. So if you look back to our blue cluster, I suppose, with all the work pressures, time pressure, if you're feeling time pressured, you don't feel you're able to continue undertake CPD. So it's all very much interlinked. But what we're trying to do with these analyses and this project is really to ascertain what we need to improve, what we need to kind of work on. Okay, thank you for taking the time to listen to me.
Thank you, Hugh. That was really fascinating. It reminds me of something in the scope framework guidance, which actually says, if you're a research manager looking at how to measure research cultures, approach the people within your organization who have research expertise in measuring things like that. So I think a really useful reminder to hear you talk through it. And now I'm pleased to welcome up Relitza.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Grace, for the invitation to come along today. It wasn't a long travel from Dundee, so it was quite easy. So for those of you who don't know me, I am normally a biomedical researcher leading a lab at the University of Dundee, but I also happen to sit on the UK Committee on Research Integrity, and I'm here today to talk to you about the work that we have been doing in the context of indicators of research integrity and how those relate to wider discussions about research culture indicators. If you haven't heard about the UK Committee on Research Integrity, that's us. We are a committee of 12 hosted by UKRI and established to deliver on recommendations by the House of Common Science and Technology Select Committee. We've got 2 co-chairs, Professors Rachel Gobberman-Hill and Professor Andrew George, and we've got 10 members who come with a broad range of expertise and experience in a wide range of sectors, including government, research policy, research across different career stages, and also publishing. And I'm right there in the second row, and I see my role as representing the researcher on the ground. So we've just heard about the importance of talking to researchers who are used to measuring, or understand what it's like to measure something responsibly and doing research in that area. And equally important, I think, it is to talk to the researchers on the ground, because they're ultimately the ones to be evaluated. And so I tend to say that I am an early career researcher representative in the committee, which is gradually becoming more of a mid-career, I suppose. I started when I was a postdoc, but now I'm obviously leading a research group. So I'm not going to bore you by reading all the different bullet points here, but I want to emphasize two key aspects of the committee's work, which is relevant today. First of all, we champion an evidence-based approach to promoting research integrity and to understanding what are the challenges in the research community, what are the opportunities, particularly in relation to identifying how systemic pressures contribute to research integrity. And when the committee was first established, everybody agreed that we need more evidence in this space. However, at the time, and to some extent still today, ways to measure the impact and the activity in the research integrity space were really not well developed and were not widely available or consistent. And so last year, the committee published our indicators of research integrity report, again, as an effort from our side to try and build this evidence base. And this report follows on from work that was initially done by Research Consulting, UKRI, Guild HE, and Cancer Research UK. And what that work had concluded was that research integrity indicators could be useful, or indicators in general, if developed for a specific purpose and if they're formative rather than performative. In other words, you want indicators that are shaping practices and that lead to specific actions, as opposed to indicators that are simply aligning with a policy, but without leading to any action. The report itself is the culmination of a highly collaborative project, both within the committee and also across a range of stakeholders and higher education institutions across the UK. The focus of the report is really on research integrity indicators that can be used by higher education institutions to improve research integrity and also to self-assess. The initial aim of the project was really, first of all, to answer the question, can we develop research integrity indicators that can be used responsibly and that could be useful for us to build the evidence base, and as I mentioned, for HEIs to self-assess and to improve their support for research integrity. And this framing and focus on HEIs was quite deliberate because it recognizes the responsibility and the role that HEIs have when it comes to improving and enabling research integrity. So this is not about assessing research integrity indicators to assess individual research outputs. That is something that will shift the responsibility onto individual researchers like myself. But this is about saying to HEIs, here is a set of indicators that you can use to see where you are on your journey to improving research integrity, not to compete with one another, but to try and understand how can you self-improve and how can institutions collaborate with one another like you're doing here to share expertise and good practice. We used the SCOPE framework, which has already been introduced, and we convened discussions across 5 workshops with over 120 diverse stakeholders from HEIs and the wider research sector. And I didn't really emphasize it on the previous slide, but we were supported by Lizzie Gatt. We were very lucky to have her on the project group as an external advisor. And we also had an external advisory group to inform all our discussions and the final set of indicators. It culminated initially in a set of a staggering number of indicators. We had 115, which was quite a headache. And we then narrowed them down to the 16 that you're sort of seeing schematically here. And those 16 indicators that are sort of the main indicators in the report span 5 different domains: leadership, strategy, procedures, practices, and skills. And those 5 domains are areas that higher education institutions have control over and where they can work to improve research integrity practice. You will notice that research culture is not listed here as a separate domain. It was actually there to begin with. However, in the process of our streamlining, the project group concluded that actually the research culture is a readout of getting this right, research integrity right across these different domains. So it's really reporting on the holistic performance of the system. And so we spread the characteristics that fit under research culture across all these different domains, because really you cannot have research integrity if you don't have a good research culture. And I experience that on a daily basis as a researcher myself. The pressures that you experience in the system really shape your practices on the ground. And also the good things that happen to you in the system also then have positive effects on you and your team on the ground. So one thing I should mention that is really important is that we didn't get to the E part of the scope process, so we haven't done the evaluation. And so we encourage stakeholders, people like yourselves, to look at this report, take the indicators, and to consider further refinement and development of guidance of their responsible use, which is why we are here today. And also to try and understand whether this prioritized set of indicators does support recognition of the conditions that foster research integrity and indirectly also a positive research culture. And last but not least, this is mostly for the committee to do, but really to try and understand the extent to which these indicators are now helping us to build an evidence base about the UK now and also into the future. This is my last slide because obviously with Jolana as the next speaker, I thought it would be appropriate for me to mention how this Research Integrity Indicators project actually relates to the REF 2029 PCE indicators. Now, remember, these are two projects that have very different origins, and they also had different aims. Our indicators are focusing specifically on research integrity, the conditions at higher HEIs that enable research to be done with integrity, and they're formative. Obviously, REF 2029 is about benchmarking, it's about distribution of funding, and the PCE component is a much broader assessment of culture rather than just specifically indicators for research integrity. That said, there are obviously overlaps, and some of you may know, but the UK CORI Research Integrity Indicators were discussed as part of Workshop 7, and I think they have informed some of the final selection of indicators that are now part of the pilot exercise. And I'll leave it there because I think we'll have to wait and see what that pilot exercise shows. We can develop these indicators with the community, but it's incredibly difficult, as Jolana, I'm sure, will tell you. And ultimately, what will tell us whether or not these will be useful is how they're taken up by the people on the ground and what their experiences show us before we decide on the final list that will be used in the exercise, and whether we can use them responsibly. That's the key question. So thank you for your attention, and this is the UK CORI Secretariat email if you want to get in touch, but otherwise, obviously, feel free to talk to me as well.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Rolitza, and you really set us up perfectly to go into Jolana's talk. It's almost like it was planned. I've gone the wrong way. No, I haven't. There?
Yes. Brilliant. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jolana Pringle and I'm Director and Deputy CEO at CRAC Vitae, and together with Technopolis UK, we led on the project to co-develop indicators to be used in the assessment of REF PCE. That project is somewhat on pause at the moment while Research England takes it into the pilot phase, but we will be returning in the summer for a couple of follow-on workshops where I think we'll be looking really to probe further some of the work that we've done so far. So I thought I'd just start with a brief reminder of the journey that we've been on in developing the indicators for REF PCE. And I could have started further back than this, but I've decided to start at June 2023 when we had the initial decisions published. We're now currently in the middle of this scale here. We started the REF PCE Indicators project at the beginning of last year. We ran a series of workshops involving over 500 stakeholders from across the sector and beyond. We synthesized all of the findings from those workshops and produced some draft indicators and frameworks, which were then reshaped by Research England and are now being piloted in those institutions. And then later on this year and early in 2026, we should see the final guidance published, which I suspect will look very different from what is being piloted in institutions at the moment. But I thought I'd start with this timeline because I think it points us towards two things. And the first one is the the time scale in which all of this is happening. And there's a really key tension here. I know institutions they're desperate for the answers. You know, they've got one eye on REF. And then on the other side this is a really lengthy piece and really expensive piece of policy development that has involved significant amounts of consultation at different stages, not just the Indicators project, but there was consultation leading up to the initial decisions, and there will be ongoing consultation through the pilot exercise, but also with the panels as well. So there's a really, really key tension there that I think is very relevant for thinking about responsible research assessment. That on the one hand, this lengthy process should hopefully allow us to do it more responsibly than we may otherwise have been doing it. But that's really challenging for institutions and for the sector more generally, who need to prepare and recognise the high price tag that is being put on this. And if we don't get it right, that's really significant. And then the other is this scale of the consultation on this. Certainly Research England and what we tried to do through the project as well have been very keen to engage broadly with a really broad range of stakeholders. And again, and that's important for a responsible research, but that's also really challenging in the context of something like REF, because you speak to REF managers, they're going to have very different opinions on what the indicators should look like, say, if you're then speaking to researchers on the ground and thinking about what they're prioritising. And then institutions, again, those in senior leadership, again, have very different perspectives on all of this. And balancing all of those, it's a bit of a puzzle. And it's one that we might not get right, we probably won't get completely right, but has been very, very important in terms of doing this responsibly. So the PCE Indicators project started at the beginning of last year. We adopted the scope approach, and we started out by doing a review of institutional strategies and statements in relation to research culture. We're very interested in understanding what's currently being valued and prioritised. We then continue to ask those questions in some initial workshops. And as I mentioned, that kind of elicited a really broad range of different aspects of research culture that could and should be considered for assessment in REF PCE. One thing that came out really strongly in those initial workshops was that there was a drive for a broad and flexible approach to research culture. So there was a strong sense that quite a narrow definition would actually be counterproductive to some of the more innovative efforts to improve research culture across the sector. It might limit innovation, might limit creativity. So that was one message that came through. But of course, there is a tension in that when we're thinking about REF PCE, where at the same time, institutions and those who are going to need to write these submissions also need very clear guidance as to what's going to be important and what they should and shouldn't include. And that's a tension that we didn't fully resolve through the project, and it's one that is being worked through the pilot exercise. And I think some of that will allow Research England to make some of those important decisions around getting that balance right between ensuring that there is that breadth and institutions have the flexibility to demonstrate what their own story is in relation to research culture and what they're doing and why they think it's important for their really distinct and unique research cultures and contexts. But on the other hand, that there is enough guidance that's specific and clear enough that it's helpful and practical, and the assessment is feasible, and that the panelists can make those judgments around quality and excellence. We asked a series of questions in the early workshops around what should be the purpose of assessing research culture in REF, and we received lots and lots of different ideas and suggestions on this, but there were two that came through really strongly. And they were to incentivize institutions. And this is really to take research culture seriously. You know, that they see this, many actually saw this as a real opportunity, an exciting opportunity to get research culture on the agendas at the very highest levels of universities. But also that it should be to reward progress within institutions, but with a very clear caveat there that should be through a journey travelled approach. That through this process, We need to recognise the diversity of this sector, the very different starting points, access to resources, to fund research culture initiatives, and that a good research culture will look very different in different contexts. When we were thinking about the principles that should underpin the indicators that we put forward to Research England, one thing again that came through really strongly and is kind of linked to that point around the importance of recognising the diversity and allowing that to come through and not be stifled through this process, was that indicators should be phrased in such a way that they reward the efficacy of what's in place, that it's relevant to the people who are within that institution, that institutions can demonstrate commitment, and that they're able to do so in ways that doesn't just show that they have more money and that they've been able to invest more in certain systems. And again, I think part of that is also recognising that you can have excellent provision on a really limited budget. And there are lots and lots of different ways of trying to get at that quality. We had multiple conversations through the workshops about the importance of reflexivity and honesty, and whether and how we can expect institutions to be honest in their PCE statements. When we're thinking about research culture, a positive research culture is very often one in which there is that openness and honesty, including around things that have failed. This is something that was linked as well to a real emphasis on the journey travelled, recognising that not everything will have worked, that some institutions will have experienced particular challenges, and that they should be given the space to explore those, to show what has worked as well as what hasn't. And that could be really useful learning piece for the sector as well, in terms of building up an evidence base around research culture and what's happening. But REF at the end of the day has a big, there's a big financial prize attached to doing well in REF, and so it was also very clear that that's a key tension that probably can't be overcome in REF PCE. There are some indicators in the current guidance that point to encouraging institutions to have those processes for continual learning in place. There is currently a context section within the draft template which tries to get at some of that, encouraging institutions to be open and honest around particularly their starting points. But it seems likely that it's never really truly going to be possible to get institutions to be honest in something like this. We asked lots and lots of different questions around what data is available. So we started in line with the scope framework. We started with what's valued in different institutions, and then we explored what kinds of data might be available to evidence those different characteristics. It was very clear that there's very little data that's being collected consistently across institutions. That made some of the initial aims for the project to find a really tightly defined set of indicators that all institutions could be asked to report again, kind of pushed some of that out the door, because that in many cases is not feasible, certainly not for this time, but it might highlight those areas where actually institutions should be starting to capture data in relation to certain aspects, and that could potentially be brought into future exercises. One of the pieces of data that we spoke about, again, pretty much in every single workshop was that around survey data. On the one hand, put forward as a really useful way of actually capturing the lived experience of not just of researchers, but research enabling staff, professional services staff as well. But that's one form of evidence that is often most likely to be open to gaining, and some real unintended consequences in that. We had some very interesting, quite creative suggestions as to what we might do instead, including a mystery shopper approach to REF PCE, and getting teams from UKRI to go and to almost Ofsted institutions. Many of them, I think some of them actually quite good suggestions, but very not feasible or practical. So in part because of those 2 points, the challenges with lots of different types of data, but also, that lack of consistency, there was a really strong sense that there should be quite a long list of indicators, but that should be, that they should be optional. And it should be up to institutions to decide, not only based on what they have, what they're able to collect with the resources they have, but also how relevant they are to the story that they want to take. And I think that's the really important one. It does, however, mean that the pilot institutions are having to deal with a very, very long list. And I do apologise for that at the moment, but that is the way that the pilot is going. There were also, and I think this is very much in line with responsible research as well, calls for there to not be an over-reliance on quantitative metrics, that metrics, particularly for something like research culture, mean very little unless they're contextualized, and that there are qualitative forms of evidence as well that are robust, that can be used to evidence many aspects of research culture. The result of this, of course, is that there have been very real and I think significant and justified concerns that this results in a higher burden than would otherwise be the case, with institutions having to write these narratives and then and think about the different forms of evidence that they can use to support this narrative. There is a key tension there, which, as I said, is one that's being worked out through the pilot exercise, and I think is why, while there are really significant limitations to the length of this piece of policy development, it is, I think, the right one if we are going to get research culture, if we are going to get it right. And then finally, when I was thinking about what I was going to say in this presentation, I went back through the Kawara principles for approaching the design of a research assessment exercise. And I just pulled out a couple of points where I think there's some useful alignment between the principles that are put forward in Kawara and the approach that we took in REF PCE. So one of these is around quality and impact. So Kawara stresses the importance of assessing research on quality, originality, transparency, and openness. And as part of that, there's a real emphasis on the importance of peer review and responsible use of metrics. One of the things that we have proposed through the REF PCE indicators work is some new criteria, including one around rigor, which is looking to assess the efficacy of the mechanisms that are in place. And also in terms of thinking about the importance of the narrative to contextualize quantitative data. And that really then continues that emphasis on peer judgment, which is what the panels are, well, certainly the pilot panels are currently grappling with. And then the second in relation to diversity, inclusiveness and collaboration. So within Kawara, there's a real emphasis on recognizing diverse activities, outputs, and all people who are involved in the research endeavor. And again, this was a really strong message that came out through REF PCE, that in fact, all the indicators, where possible, should be worded in a way that is inclusive of all staff, whether or not they are research active, certainly research active for the context of being returned within the, or having their outputs returned within a REF context, but also thinking, around things like the development of staff, that this shouldn't just focus on early career researchers or even researchers. We should be thinking about professional and career development of everyone who's involved in research, and in using that inclusive language was very, very important. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Can I invite our panel to come and sit up at the front? Do we have any questions in the room to get us started? Yes. We're going to have to get you to wait for the microphone so that they can hear you online.
So in that last talk, you talked about getting institutions to be honest on the REF submissions, and that being quite difficult. And my immediate thought was, how do you get institutions to be honest with themselves? I think most institutions most of the time aren't honest about what their real problems are. That's quite difficult to do just because of how people work. And how do you get that internal honesty that could result in you actually being able to knowing what to put honestly on an application form?
Thank you. I'm feeling that's a question for Yolanda, but I think that is also broadly a question for when we are looking at measuring research cultures and monitoring research cultures. How do we challenge ourselves to actually be willing to tackle the negatives and accept that there will be negative aspects of our research cultures that need to be measured as well? So Yolanda, I'll pass to you to start.
I mean, I don't think we can. Is this on?
Yeah, you might need to hold it
Yeah.
closer.
I don't think we can. And I think there's a really important thing there about getting people to speak to each other internally. I think that's a question that is probably separate from REF, in the sense that I don't think that can be encouraged through the REF process, but it could be encouraged through a ground up approach to research culture strategies and reform within an individual institution, where people who are working within that institution flag those issues, those disconnects, and the need to perhaps be more honest and open and value things that fail. When we were speaking about it in a REF context, there were lots of suggestions. A separate section that isn't published. There was actually rewarding institutions, so almost kind of more negative that they could be. Perhaps that would be weighted, but there's just so many unintended consequences with that, and ultimately very.
Anyone else want to know?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment, perhaps as somebody who thinks a lot about this also in relation to being honest in research, because we have this eternal problem more generally, right? So how do you encourage honesty, say, in research publications? And I think ultimately it comes down to incentives. And the incentives that are within an institution will very much shape the behavior of the individuals in that institution. So ultimately, I think there is something to be said about promotion criteria, hiring practices, and it's the leadership locally that will determine the extent to which honesty is on the agenda or not. The same applies in the microcosm of a small research group as well. If I'm honest and if I instill honesty in the research that we do and that I supervise my student according to those standards, then they will obviously they will comply with that practice. But if they never see it in their peers, then bad culture breeds more bad culture.
Yeah. You, Sarah, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, just at Newcastle University, we've been thinking about this topic, and I guess we've had to slightly separate evaluation from that kind of honesty diagnosis. So we're just piloting at the moment a maturity framework, which units broadly aligned to kind of REF units of assessment are just piloting at the moment. So this is kind of taking different topics across research culture and I guess doing a kind of a check as to where they are situated in terms of their maturity against various different spheres of research culture. So it might be on, say, leadership, and they're, I guess, having honest conversations. We're obviously working through the motions of how you get to a place where you can make an honest assessment as to where you are. Conversations like, do you need to underpin this with survey data? Do you need to go and talk to people on the ground to make those assessments? It can't be just something done in a room of research leaders. It has to be something that's collaboratively done. But crucially, I think we've separated it from this is the evaluation piece. It's the piece that comes before that as a bit of a kind of self-reflection tool.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Hugh, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just to add a short thing there, I suppose I think my panelists have answered that question very well. Just, I suppose, in terms of UCD, I think we're very lucky that UCD is fully behind our research culture initiative. And as you can see from our findings in our project, they're not always favorable. I think, ultimately, obviously, it benefits everyone if you can look in those dark corners and air them out.
Thanks, Hugh. And this reminds me of something that came up at a Research Integrity and Culture Week event yesterday, where essentially we were talking about what makes a positive research culture, and the table I was at, it was raised, if the leaders are willing to acknowledge and recognize that there are issues, that makes for a positive research culture because it means you can change them. Do we have any questions online? Can we go to Emma? Devon, if you've got your running shoes on to run across the room.
So we have two questions for Sarah, but we'll just do one for now. One is that you mentioned, Sarah, you can probably see this online anyway, but for everyone else in the room, I'll paraphrase. So that you mentioned that hundreds of staff members fed back on what a positive research culture looks like. And just wondering if you could comment on how you facilitated that kind of feedback and who was involved, like what did you practically do to get that number of staff? Because there are challenges in getting people to engage.
Yeah, of course. So across the research strategy, we often run various community workshops, whether it's developing a new interdisciplinary centre. So we use that kind of framework to do this exercise of asking that very broad question to a group. It was, as I mentioned in my talk, it was through an open invitation. So anybody in the university who was there at the time could attend. We had quite a mix of colleagues from professional services, academic roles, from across disciplines. We had about 100 colleagues there, as I mentioned. And because it was during COVID type times, we were online. So we had kind of facilitated breakout rooms where kind of all kind of views were taken into account. We had Jamboards, and I don't know if you remember those times when we had that kind of setup for everything. And then I don't know if I mentioned in my talk, after we'd done that kind of first community workshop, we then invited the group to attend the context setting kind of focus group. We had 20 colleagues at that stage, again through open invitation. So yeah, that then was obviously a more focused conversation of what the values look and feel like. I think there's a question, isn't there, in terms of did we send out a survey? At that point in time, we didn't, because what this was designed to do was to kind of create a framework for our future work, not only the way we evaluate, but the way we structured our action plan. So before sort of finalising our action plan, we did send out a survey, but using the framing of those cultural values-led domains that I showed you. So really shaping the way we evaluated and delivered our work, really, prior to kind of doing any large-scale further consultation through a survey.
Thanks, Sarah. Do we have any other reflections on how to maximize engagement? I mean, Hugh, I was really surprised by the response rate to your survey. If we send out a survey, we'd be incredibly fortunate to get that many responses.
Yeah, well, I suppose this survey was actually conducted before I joined the team. But
you can't take credit.
No, but I do know that, like, for example, we're conducting World Cafes with the different categories of researchers and members of the research community, as on the slides. And it has been difficult to, get good representation for those cafes. And obviously that does come down to workload, which ties into all the issues we were talking about. So, but yeah, I think there was a lot of engagement with specific groups before, like during the lead up to the survey, and we are working hard now to increase our impact, or our recruitment, our response rate for this next survey. Yeah. So yeah, I have no real good answers.
I think we've got time for one more question. There's Jemina back.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed all of those presentations. I'm at Heriot-Watt University, and I think one of the conversations that we're having a lot is around how we can be responsible ourselves for our research evaluation of research culture. And my concern is around sustainability, especially because it's the last couple of years, there's been a massive shift to focusing on how we foster positive research culture and how we evaluate it. There's also been funding available some to some universities, some not to other universities. And so my concern, I suppose, is a question is about how do we ensure that this is sustainable? Because the money is not always going to be available for all these research culture projects. So when the projects finish, how can we ensure that all of those activities are really embedded in what we do and therefore sustainable? So with the PCE exercise, I know Yolanda, like I'm shooting the messenger a little bit here because you're not making the final decisions. So I'm not really asking you to answer this question. I'm just rambling now. I'm thinking about that longer term. So, once all the funding stops, how do we ensure that the research culture work is really embedded and it's really meaningful and authentic, and it's not just, we've got some money, let's do this great research culture work and let's assess it, and in the PCE it looks fab, and then the rest exercise is over and then it all disappears. And that's something that really concerns me quite a lot, that we need to sort of make sure that that's always at the forefront, I think, of our minds. So I think that's probably a comment more than a question. I don't know. Anyway, back to you.
So I think a good challenge for the panel, how can we make this sustainable? How can we sustain the momentum of the people who are willing to come to this event today? Does anyone have an answer?
I don't have an answer, but I might just want to throw the question back a bit. I've been wondering the same. So why do we have sustainable health and safety practices, for example? Why is that the default? So how do we make it the default? And again, I think that's a change in culture, ultimately. And it's because there are regulations in place, and obviously everybody understands how important it is to have good health and safety in place. So I'm not a social scientist, but I think a social scientist may be able to provide more advice here on aspects of theory of change. How do we introduce or implement some of these initiatives in a way that actually results in change, as opposed to it looks good on paper, right? I don't have the answer, but I do wonder why we don't have research integrity or research culture being the default like it is in health and safety. The number of times one has to do health and safety training doesn't measure up with the number of times you do it for integrity or how to behave as a good colleague.
Yeah, I'd follow on that from that by thinking about all the other areas where we have seen a real culture shift within universities. So we speak about research culture as if it's something completely new, but it brings together support for people, engagement, collaboration. They're all areas where different organizations, different institutions, initiatives, they've all been working to affect a culture change, some cases for decades. I work for CRAC Vitae. We've been around since 1964, trying to build the case for the importance of careers of researchers beyond academia. Recognizing that things like research and development are important and should be embedded in institutions requires a culture shift. And in some of those areas that are now kind of under that much broader umbrella of research culture, there has been real progress. And I think there are some real opportunities to learn from that, to ensure that this isn't that we don't just move on to the next thing, which I can already see happening. But anyway, that's a different conversation, not one that should be recorded. And then there's another part of that, which is the legacy of initiatives. And yes, I think you're very right to point to the proliferation of initiatives, and those funding streams, they will come to an end, probably within the next couple of years. And I think the point there to be made is around the importance of ensuring that we're rigorously evaluating those initiatives so we can really understand what works. I was part of a project a couple of years ago for UKRI that looked at research culture initiatives in the UK, and we found that very, very few initiatives around research culture have been evaluated. I know that is changing, particularly with the Wellcome projects, which have evaluation built in. But I think until we have that evidence, that evidence base needs to be there before we can think about, where we should be investing, what's going to be an increasingly limited pot of funding. This is
Okay.
nice.
Oh, it's better. I think coming back to the point about health and safety being so mandatory is health and safety is important because it's, you don't, have actions and behaviors and practices that are deleterious to people's health. And I think that's where our project is really nice, because we're looking at mental health. So I think it does come back to also the importance of establishing an evidence base. And where, like in Ireland, we have an All Ireland of Ireland Research Culture Network, and we are hoping in the future to share our survey between more and more institutions to get a stronger and stronger evidence base. But I think establishing that there are aspects of research culture when we have poor research culture that do negatively impact the mental health of the research community, I think that would be a very useful way of establishing the sustainability of research culture practices.
Run off with my microphone down, that's it. Sarah, did you want to add anything? That's quite a nice way to conclude the session, is, challenging us to think about the sustainability of our actions. Did you want to come in, Sarah, just to have a last word? Are you all right?
I'm actually okay. I was just answering a kind of question in the chat. And I'm happy to sort of say what I put in the chat if that's helpful. Just so that everyone can kind of hear what I said. Yeah. So it was just in response to a question about bullying and harassment and misconduct data. Because I mentioned there wasn't a kind of suitable indicator. Because it's not clear what leads to this rise in numbers or change in numbers. So I just mentioned that we're running a project called Behaviour Matters, led by V Parker in our organisational development team. And there's various sort of strands to this project, from kind of sort of tackling bullying and harassment, the kind of challenging aspects of that, and then the more positive aspects of promoting the behaviours we want to see in our research culture. And actually, we've been looking at new measures through approaching this from a theory of change model, to kind of demonstrate the success of the project. And survey data will certainly play a role there. And there was a question about reputation and kind of, are we concerned, I guess, about that? And I suppose, like any institution, we want those figures to be zero. We don't want to see instances of misconduct or bullying and harassment. But we also kind of want to show that we are strengthening our culture at every opportunity. And I think, like any research intensive university, we can always improve. And I guess we want our initiatives in our research culture action plan, in our programme, to eventually become business as usual. And I think that's the point we're always working towards with any kind of form of strategy implementation. So I guess my answer perhaps to the question about sustainability does kind of feed quite nicely into the response to this question, that we're trying to build these innovations into the brickwork of our universities, to ensure that positive change is there for people to benefit from for sort of years to come, really.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. That's such a nice positive note to end on. So just to finish us off, I just want to say thank you to all of our speakers today. You've really provided us with some fantastic insights and challenges to go away and think about. And thank you to our attendees in the room and also online. And as another thank you to our organisers for today's event, but also all of the Research Integrity and Culture Week events, including our colleagues at Heriot-Watt University, Dundee and Queen Margaret University. For those of you in the room who are Strathclyde staff members, there's a QR code on the screen there to give us your feedback about the event today. But I'd also encourage you to join our workshop, which is happening in 10 minutes, on how we can enhance Strathclyde's research cultures, really taking what we've heard today and trying to implement it into what we're doing at Strathclyde. But thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you.